Welcome everyone to another episode of the Into the Deep project. Today it's a great honour for us to welcome our special guest, Monica Doumit, who is the Director of Public Affairs and Engagement for the Archdiocese of Sydney, along with a columnist for the Catholic Weekly. Monica, welcome.
Thank you so much.
It's amazing for you to be here. I think a lot of people within the community know of you for the various advocacy that you provided over a number of issues over the last few years, particularly around abortion, marriage, etc. But today we've got you here speaking about the pro-life agenda. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fitting because as we meet tonight around this particular time, as many would be aware in the community, a bill has been presented in New South Wales Parliament by the Greens Party, which in essence would force doctors, despite their conscientious objections, to perform abortions. And we saw in Canberra recently that a Catholic hospital was overtaken by the government because that hospital refused to perform abortions, given that it was against the teachings of the church. And so I think there's a lot of concern and a lot of cautiousness around at the moment about what this bill could mean, and that's why we had last week the rally where there was thousands of people that turned up in the steps of Parliament. Can you give a little bit more of an outline about that bill and what the ramifications could be? I mean, I gave a little bit of a summary, but yeah.
Sure thing. So it was presented last month in February by New South Wales Upper House member, she's a Greens member, Dr. Amanda Conn. Now, in her first speech ever in Parliament after she was elected, she said, look, I'm an abortionist, and so this is part of my agenda coming into Parliament. So it was very clear from the beginning. And the bill that she's presented would do four things. The first thing it would do is that it would give the New South Wales Health Minister the ability to require public hospitals or public health organisations, some of which are Catholic hospitals like St Vincent's, to perform abortions. So it doesn't require them automatically, but it gives the New South Wales Health Minister that power to order that to be the case. The second thing it does is require health practitioners, so doctors, nurses, midwives and others who themselves conscientiously object to abortion, to make a referral for a woman to an abortionist. So I think Pope Francis uses the language of that's like hiring a hitman. So for those who conscientiously object, that would be too close a participation in the death of that child by making a referral to an abortionist. And the truth is that most of them would just quit. They wouldn't stay in a profession where they were required to do that. The third thing it would do, it would allow nurses to prescribe abortion drugs to women. So at the moment, if a woman wants to get an abortion up till 9 weeks, she goes to a doctor for a prescription of a drug that will do that. This would allow nurses to do the same thing. And fourth, remove some of the reporting requirements or all of the reporting requirements around abortion. So basically making sure that there's no data collected on how many abortions are happening in the state, what types of circumstances, and those things. So they're the four things that bill would do.
Why is that important, that fourth point? That's quite interesting that you mentioned that. I wasn't aware of that. Why is that important for them not to be collecting the data?
Well, because I think the broad strokes of the bill is really to remove the moral question around abortion. So once you start saying, well, I think it's estimated now that in New South Wales, we already don't keep very good data, but it's estimated there are something like 30,000 abortions every year in New South Wales. So that's close to 100 abortions a day. Wow. Women are supposed to be asked about domestic violence. We know that 1 in 5 women who experience domestic violence first experience it when they fall pregnant. So once you start recording some of those things, abortion stops looking like the free choice that its advocates want to tell you it is. And it starts to be a symptom of sometimes some other social pressures, some family violence or other things. And so I think the removal of those data reporting requirements just keeps all of this in the dark.
Wow, that's so interesting. I wasn't aware of that. And it is actually quite confronting, the fact that we can't even reflect on it if it was to pass. God willing it doesn't, but there's no opportunity for reflection after or debate in the public square around whether this is actually right for society or not, or if there's any other ways that we can help the people that are thinking that this is their only resort to go and have an abortion performed.
Well, that's one of the big things about the attempt to extend these abortion laws. We already have some of the most extreme abortion laws in the whole world here in New South Wales, because abortion is already legal right up until the day of birth. There's already a prohibition on people being within 150 metres of an abortion clinic to pray, to offer help, or to do anything like that. The idea of trying to force faith-based hospitals to provide abortions and to force doctors and other medical professionals to refer is about trying to take the moral question out of abortion. So you've got nobody objecting to it publicly. That's the idea. This isn't about availability. They'll tell you it's about availability and people in rural and regional areas and stuff like that. It's not about that. They could provide abortion clinics out there and that are government run and government funded if that's what they wanted to do. This is about removing any public objection to abortion so that their hope is that future generations won't even think about this as a moral question.
Which raises even more questions about religious freedom and the place of religion in society generally, right?
Absolutely. This is why there are so many attempts to restrict what can be said and by faith groups, right? And characterising it as hate speech. We hear a lot about we need to ban hate speech. We need to have these strong anti-vilification laws so that there's no hate speech. Look, nobody wants anybody inciting violence, encouraging violence or harm or property damage or anything like that. But you can't take things that I disagree with that offends me, calling that hate speech and trying to make it criminal. Because what it does, it just removes not only public debate, but the ability for people to search for truth. The truth is going to offend people sometime. I mean, Christ offended people with what he said. The truth will stir people's consciences. It will be hard to hear sometimes, but that's okay.
Yeah, I remember the words of the former Premier, Doumit, who himself was an Opus Dei Catholic, used to speak about the need for debate in the public square because that's where innovation and thought and different ideas can come to the forefront. But it seems on this particular issues, among a few others, particularly ones that have moral questioning around them, I feel like particularly the media and the government over the last few years has really tried to silence the conscience votes or the conscience opinions that have been raised, which is very concerning. I feel very much for doctors and nurses. I wanted to ask you, Monica, do you have any information or data around the support or uptake from doctors and nurses about this? Because as you would know, doctors, when they become doctors or they're sworn in, they take the Hippocratic Oath, which is an oath basically, in summary, one of the oaths that they take is that they will do no harm, no intentional harm. So, obviously things can happen on the operating table or when they're dealing with patients, but that really goes directly against the whole premise of abortion, right? Where you're intentionally taking a life. Do you have any data, or have you spoken to any doctors or nurses about these about abortion generally, and maybe even this potential law that's coming up, or this potential bill that could become law?
So I don't have any data on that. I do know anecdotally of sort of young trainee doctors who've had to leave the state because it was too hard for them to train in obstetrics here in New South Wales and avoid performing abortion, being involved in it in any way. And they've had to move interstate to other places where they've been able to find more sympathetic hospitals or places to train under. Certainly I know that there are groups of doctors who get together doctors and sort of medical students and people like that, Catholic and others of goodwill, who actually want to help each other in terms of protecting their conscience, and sort of there's a community and a fraternity of those there. There's a new group called Pro-Life Health Professionals that's raised up as well, which again is people from across the country just standing up and saying, no, we're we're health professionals who are actually for life, and trying to build a community, because I think this can be very, very isolating. I'm not sure, like I said, I'm not sure about abortion, but certainly when euthanasia was introduced, the people who drafted the Queensland euthanasia law, so pro-euthanasia Queensland academics, were saying that it's becoming more difficult for younger doctors to object to euthanasia because of what their superiors might want them to do.
Wow. Yeah, that's very concerning, particularly at a time where we are short of medical professionals in Australia. It is quite a big crisis, and this might be the thing that really tips it over the edge and ensures that a lot of the good ones particularly are kind of sent into other professions, which is a very big concern. I wanted to raise, Monica, one of the things that I think about a lot around the debate about abortion. At the beginning, when we were discussing this a few years ago, and even many years ago when abortion became like a really big topic in the media, there was always the conversation around abortion at early term, and the language that was used was, it's just a clump of cells, it's an embryo, it's just a fetus, it hasn't got a heartbeat, it can't survive without the mother, therefore it's not a life on its own, etc., etc. I'm not saying I agree with those analogies, I'm just kind of outlining some of the discussion or some of the points that pro-abortion advocates were kind of sharing. But now, given the law has changed significantly, and as you mentioned, you can have abortion up until the day that the baby is born. And I believe in New South Wales, if a baby is born after an abortion that was failed, then they are not to treat the baby even after it's been born. Is that correct?
Not in New South Wales, actually.
No,
that was one of the very few concessions that was entered into the what became the Abortion Act in 2019.
But they tried to bring it in.
They tried to, yeah, but it was for the courage of people like Kevin Connolly and Tanya Davies and others who stood up and at least got those concessions in. But in many other parts of Australia, that's right.
It's legal at the moment, isn't it?
It's legal. So the idea in the law in New South Wales is currently that if a baby is born alive after a failed abortion, it needs to get the same care that a wanted baby, for want of a better term, would get if they were born alive at that stage. But in other parts of Australia, that's not the case. And you hear some really harrowing stories from midwives and others who talk about babies being just left to die in a kidney dish or something like that. Others who will nurse the baby. They're not allowed to provide medical intervention, but will at least nurse the child so that they're not just left to die on a bench or something like that. It's really horrific and harrowing stuff.
It's inhumane. My thinking around this, and I haven't asked people about their opinion about this generally, but surely society generally would be against abortion at that level. I don't agree with the argument about the early term, but I can understand how people who aren't aware and haven't done the proper research can follow that line of thinking that it's not a human being, it's just a fetus, it's just an embryo, it's just a clump of cells. But when it gets to that point where it's at 9 months, where it can function completely on its own if it was delivered, surely there's many people in society, or a majority of people in society, disagree with that. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a study in the Medical Journal of Australia a few years ago, probably back around the time of the New South Wales abortion debate, actually. And I think it was something like only 12% of Australians agree with third trimester abortions, so 6 months onwards. The only time when you get majority support for abortion is in that first trimester, so in the first 12 weeks. And after that, the numbers drop in the second trimester and then drop dramatically in the third trimester. I actually think most Australians aren't even aware that abortion is legal right up until birth.
Yeah, I would agree.
And they would be absolutely horrified. You would have seen the work of Dr. Joanna Howe, and that's one of the big things that she's trying to bring attention to let people know that this is actually happening, because the first step is awareness, right? The problem with abortion is that so much of it happens in the dark. because we're too scared to talk about it. Like you've mentioned, the media aren't going to talk about it. They want to stop collecting data. They want to, they're trying to pass laws to stop the public conversation. And as a church, sometimes we're really awkward talking about it. I think the stats are something like 1 in 3 women in their lifetime will have an abortion.
1 in 3.
1 in 3. And so that's quite a, even if you don't know it, you would know a woman who's had an abortion. And so we want to be delicate and tender to let women know of the mercy of God and those types of things. And so we can become a little bit reticent about speaking actually about the horrors of what goes on in these clinics.
Yeah, I remember the movie that came out a few years ago. I can't remember what it was called. The one about the Planned Parenthood director. That
Unplanned.
Unplanned. That was so eye-opening, that movie. What was her name again?
Abby Johnson.
Abby Johnson, yeah. Did you watch that?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, I remember sitting through it and just thinking, wow, like it's interesting that lady herself had multiple abortions and had never seen the what do they call it?
The ultrasound?
The ultrasound.
Yeah.
She'd never seen the ultrasound until that time when she was assisting that doctor to perform the abortion, and when she saw that there was actually a life in there that was being hurt while they were being aborted, how that changed. And that's why when you mention about the darkness surrounding it, I wonder how many abortions would have been performed if women might have been more educated about what's involved in it and what happens to the actual baby during the process of an abortion, and also what happens after to the women, because that's a big thing, isn't it? Right? There's a lot of potential side effects for women, not only in the short term but also in the long term, if they have an abortion performed. Is that correct?
Well, I only know from anecdotal evidence of women who have sort of reported a lot of, particularly on the anniversary of the abortion and things like that, a lot of sorrow, a lot of grief, and something that doesn't really leave them. And I think that there's the abortion advocates will want to say, no, it's fine. Like there's no mental health problems, there's no emotional problems, you'll be fine. And so it actually leaves some women who are harmed. Maybe not every woman who has an abortion has sort of, maybe it doesn't disturb the consciences of all of them, but it does quite a number of them. But with an abortion industry just telling them, no, you're fine, like there are no mental health effects, what you actually get is you get a group of women who don't have anywhere to turn for support. They don't have anywhere to go with their grief. Often people in their lives don't know that that's what they've been through. They're too scared to come to a church or something like that to receive support. And those who were supposedly advocating for their choice, it's an inconvenient truth for the abortion industry that there are women who are hurting after abortion.
Well, I remember hearing, you might know Nicki Minaj, the rapper in America. She once was interviewed and spoke about the fact that she had had an abortion, and it was one of the biggest regrets that she'd ever had in her life. She continued on to say she couldn't judge anyone else who was having one, and she's not going to tell people not to have it because for her she felt that would be judging them. But she spoke about that being one of the biggest regrets of her life. You would never probably hear that in the mainstream media too much, but because of the fact that she's a celebrity. But I found that interesting, and I've heard of other scenarios. There was the late Charlotte Dawson, the one from Australia's Next Top Model, the one who was married to the Olympic swimmer Scott Miller. She fell pregnant during his preparation for the Sydney Olympics, and he said to her, look, I can't bring up a baby, I'm training for the Olympics. She had an abortion, and she spoke about that time beginning the process, or beginning a really difficult, it was the beginning of a very difficult time in her life that just spiraled, not just from the abortion. Obviously other things happened to her, but she spoke about the depression that she experienced and the sorrow after the abortion. So there are two examples that I know of. But going back to what I was saying about the whole law and the perception from when it was initially, it's a clump of cells, and it's just a fetus and they're just embryos and it's not able to survive on its own, to the way that the law has evolved now to abortion up until the baby is actually born and leaving it to die after, I feel like the argument of science kind of went out the window, and now it's just purely about choice. Do you think that women are making a fully informed choice?
Oh, look, it's hard to say. I think you're right. I think that this isn't about science anymore.
Yeah, I don't think
nobody
it ever
can
was,
argue that
yeah.
that's not a separate human life in there. What they say is that it's the mother's choice trumps that of the child. So it's about who actually gets to make the decision. I think that's it. Look, some women are making a fully informed choice, but others I can't. Informed and free, I would think, are probably the two big things.
That's probably a better way to describe it, yeah.
Well, so in terms of informed, if you've never parented a child before, if you've never been through childbirth, if you've never raised a child, there's no way that you can make a properly informed choice about abortion, because how do you know? How do you know what you're saying no to in that moment? So I think that's one big thing about informed, but also freedom. Like I said, I think the stats are something like 1 in 5 women who experience domestic violence do so for the very first time that they fall pregnant, or the first time they experience domestic violence is after or during pregnancy. I tell a story, but I've got a little goddaughter who was originally slated for abortion because her mother was living in a women's shelter, and they said to her, well, if you decide you want to keep the baby, then you're going to have to leave because this is a women's shelter, not a family shelter. So her so-called choice was between accommodation and homelessness. That's not a choice. Women who are worried about losing their jobs or those types of things. So I think there are a lot of things that play into the freedom of a woman when it comes to bearing and raising a child, and just writing it off as, oh, no, it's just the woman's choice. Part of it is absolving men of any responsibility, and also absolving society of any responsibility to that woman and to that child.
What do you mean by that?
So when abortion was less common, when it was illegal, if a woman fell pregnant unexpectedly, it was usually expected that the dad of that child would stick around and help with the raising of that child. Now, it's the woman's problem. You don't want, dad doesn't want the child, then you can keep the child to the woman, or you can have an abortion. That's your choice, and you're making the choice, and you have to deal with the consequences of that choice. The community would step around, would surround a woman maybe whose husband or whose partner, the father of the child, left. The government would step in with some type of financial support. But now there's this idea, well, if a woman has a so-called choice to abortion, then the responsibility of raising that child, if she decides to keep it, becomes her own to bear and hers alone. Does that make sense?
We advocate for life, and we're against abortion. But what are the other options available? Are there other options? If you fall pregnant and it's unplanned or it's inconvenient or through rape, like what are the options for a woman to continue carrying the baby? Well,
I think that, first of all, the Catholic worldview is that sexual activity should be reserved for committed marriage, right? So that you shouldn't actually be conceiving a child outside of a relationship where you're committed to each other and committed to the raising of children. That's our worldview. For those who don't subscribe to that, then what happens in the situations where there are unplanned pregnancies, unwanted pregnancies, pregnancies that are going to be challenging, whether the child's been diagnosed with an illness or a disability or something like that will impact them going forward. I think the first thing is if the woman is unmarried, we want dad to stick around. We want dad to stick around and take responsibility for the raising of that child. I think that'd be the first thing. But then if for some reason, through tragedy, through his own choices, she's left alone, then we need the community to start stepping in around her. Her family first, hopefully, but if not, the community. So she shouldn't be worried about losing her job. She shouldn't be worried about not being able to finish her education. There are some great pro-life groups and pregnancy centres and others who will provide those wraparound supports. But that's really a job for the church, right? If we are pro-life, then we should be doing things like that as well. Same with people whose babies are diagnosed in utero with a disease or an illness or something like that. It's our job to step in. And then failing the community and failing support from the community, support from the church, that's when the state should step in and say, okay, if we're really concerned about choices for women, if we really want to label ourselves as pro-choice, then we're going to make it easy enough for this woman to have this child and raise this child, and not have to worry about other things that might affect her decision.
Monica, I just want to touch on your thoughts around why abortion has become such a big issue, particularly in the political domain, not just from a legislation perspective, but so much advocacy and celebration, particularly on both sides of politics around abortion. Like we saw in America when they passed those laws, there was great celebration around it. That's obviously been repealed now in America, and they're a lot tougher on their abortion laws. But in Australia, I remember when they passed those laws in 2019, there was a great deal of celebration among the politicians. I've always been sceptical around things in politics, and I know we discussed it off air around follow the money. Mm. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is I think, unfortunately, the attraction for abortion is sex without consequences, right? That's sort of the immediate. But it's only without immediate consequences because long term, as we've started to mention, there are sort of flow-on effects. But I always say when someone is offering you choice, maybe ask who is either making money off it or who's saving money off the choice that I'm being offered, right? We were just talking about before, what are the other options available for a woman who falls pregnant unexpectedly? In order for her to be supported and to be provided the supports she needs in order to raise that child, that costs money, right? That costs money, that costs resources, either of the community or of the state, particularly if that child has some health issues or some disability or something like that. It's much easier to give a woman the choice of an abortion. When the laws were overturned in the US a couple of years ago, like you were talking about, some of the companies that were just like, oh, that's okay, we'll fund abortions for any of our female staff members who want them. We'll even fly you to a state where abortion is legal so that you can go get your abortion there. This idea of abortion now became part of your employee benefits. But doesn't that just save the company money on things like maternity leave and time off work and those types of things? So this choice that they're offering is actually saving them money. Same with the government. If we go further to sort of the contraception IVF industry, which I think is just two sides of the same coin, we say to women, oh, okay, that's great. You can take the pill from, age 16 to age 35 or whatever you want to, and so you can control your fertility. Spending money to take a pill every day that they don't need, that's actually stopping something naturally occurring in their body, pumping themselves full of artificial hormones, and then try to get them pregnant through IVF at a time when they're not fertile and their body's not supposed to be fertile, pumping them through a whole other bunch of hormone therapy. The IVF industry at the moment is something like a $700 million annual industry in Australia. Like $2 million a day is made on IVF in Australia. So it's all about, here are some choices for women. Who's making money off the choice? The people who invest in these companies. Some of these IVF companies are listed on the stock exchange. You can trade shares. In IVF, that's not choice. It's extraordinary to me that even some of the women who advocate strongly for some of these things just don't realise they're being played. Nothing's empowering about these types of things.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about actually, and probably adds another side of the lens to the whole abortion, pro-abortion argument, is that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. I know in America, Planned Parenthood make billions and billions of dollars from performing abortions, and the doctors that are performing them make money out of it. And I often feel like it's like, is there a more emotive purchase? Like you would pay all the money in the world if you could, if you didn't want a child, to get rid of that child. And so they're often at the mercy of the medical professionals or the companies or the organisations to charge whatever they wanted to charge in order to perform the abortion, or, as you said, the IVF, for example, where you're desperate to have a child. You would spend all the money in the world if you can. I understand, particularly around the IVF issue, that it often causes a lot of issues in relationships, a lot of strain on relationships, not only financially but also like between husbands and wives, for example. Is that correct?
Well, again, all I know is anecdotally. But certainly because, again, you are, just from a basic biological perspective, you are sort of messing with someone's hormones, which can never help in an emotional situation. But also your entire life sort of becomes sort of centred on that process and what's going to happen out of the process. You separate the unitive and the procreative aspect of sexual intimacy, and conceiving a child now becomes sort of something you do with the aid of drugs and doctors and petri dishes and all of those types of things. So something that's supposed to be the most intimate moment between a husband and wife then just gets broadened out, and I would imagine it puts a lot of strain on relationships. Yeah.
With the way that society has shifted, and particularly around legislation around this issue, and also, as we discussed earlier, around, I think, the fear or reservation for a lot of people to bring up or kind of talk or have a debate about this particular topic, it can often feel like we are fighting a losing battle. Even though there was some great hope about what happened in America with obviously the overturning of Roe versus Wade, I think that really re-energised a lot of pro-life supporters that, through prayer and persistence, obviously, God's graces are still at work. To quote St. Paul, where sin did abound, grace did abound much more. In Australia at the moment, given and I think you'd agree, we probably have some of the harshest abortion laws in the world, not only in Australia but in the world. It can often feel like, particularly at this time now with this bill that's been proposed, that you might hear a lot of people say, "Oh, look, it's inevitable. They're going to pass this law anyway. They've done that with the other bills that they proposed to Parliament." I remember clearly in 2019, I was there at the rally in front of Parliament House with the thousands and thousands of others that were, rallying against the abortion laws that they eventually passed. I remember you wrote an article in the Catholic Weekly. I never forget it. It's actually stayed with me, not only because of that particular topic, but just generally when there's situations that may seem like it's already a losing battle. You quoted somebody that once said, "It matters how you lose." Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
So yeah, it was. It comes from a play called The Lion in Winter, and it's. I might get this a little bit wrong, but so the king had 3 sons and didn't want any of them to inherit, to become his heir. He wanted to marry somebody else and have a new heir. So he imprisoned all of his sons, one of whom was Richard the Lionheart, and there's this scene amongst the 3 brothers where they think that they're hearing their dad come to execute them, and Richard says, well, he's not going to get any satisfaction out of me. He's not going to see me beg. And one of his brothers said, "You fool, what does it matter the way a man falls down?" To which Richard responded, when the fall is all that's left, it matters a great deal. So back in 2019, we knew that debate was lost when we started having it. We knew it was all stitched up. We knew they had the numbers. But we needed to fight and say that this was wrong. The church needed to show up. We needed to show up in great number and in great voice to speak to an injustice that was happening. It's on the church to call out injustice whenever it is happening and to fight for it. And also, I do think that our losses do sow seeds for bearing fruit in the future. You talked about Roe versus Wade a little while ago and that decision in America. There was a woman who started the March for Life on the first anniversary of Roe versus Wade. Her name was Nellie Gray, and she was a lawyer at the time, about 50 years old, and she decided that she wanted to have this march to object to the fact that the court case had happened and to encourage Congress to pass a law to change it. And she thought, they'll change the law. We only have to have one march. Then a year passed and nothing had changed with the law. So they had a second march and a third march and a fourth march. She died about 12 years before the law finally got overturned in the US. She'd been marching for 38 years.
Wow.
And then it was another 12 after that before they actually saw the fruits of that. Jade, we might see success in our lifetime. We might, but we might not. Maybe what God has called our generation to do is just to keep fighting, but just so that we can educate a next generation and a generation after that, so that, please God, your children or grandchildren may reap the results of the work that we do. This time, like, we can't, yes, of course we need to be concerned about fruits. Of course we need to be concerned about winning. But also there's part of that we just have to surrender to the Lord and just say, look, this is for you, and that, a generation yet unborn may praise the Lord at some point.
I often reflect about the side effects that abortion has caused in society, or an abortion mentality has led to. And in my mind, I think that it's opened the way for the vulnerable to feel a lot more threatened, because a lot of the premise or a lot of the argument for abortion is that if a child is going to have issues once they're born, such as disability or whatever it is, that they should be spared of that suffering, along with their parents being spared of that. And also, I personally believe that a society where the child, the most vulnerable in their mother's womb, is no longer safe. To quote a priest that I once heard speak about it, he said that the mother's womb used to be the safest place on earth, where the mother would do whatever she could to protect her child. And now that's been compromised. And I think it speaks volumes for the direction that society has taken. And people might think it's weird to say, but I feel like life has been devalued so much. You only need to turn on the news to hear about people being killed mercilessly, injured with no remorse from the attackers. And I'm not suggesting that that's directly because of abortion, but if we think of the mindset that's creeped into society, where we can choose who has life and who doesn't, and cover it up and celebrate it, I feel like the side effects of that are quite detrimental, have been and will continue to be detrimental in society. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, look, you can either start with St. Mother Teresa, who said if a woman can kill the life of her own child within her womb, what is it left for you and I to kill each other?
Exactly.
Something like that. But also Pope Francis talks about the throwaway culture, this idea that if there is a life that is inconvenient to me, if I can discard of it, whether that's a child in the womb, whether that's an elderly person with a terminal illness or something like that, that there's this idea that we can just throw things away and we can throw human life away. And if we don't have this idea that we are, as a culture, responsible for the protection of everyone, but particularly of our most vulnerable, then if we can dispose of our most vulnerable, discard them, then why can't we discard people who are less vulnerable, who are stronger, those types of things? Is that societies are measured, that what's the quote is something along the lines, you can tell the integrity of a society by the way it treats its most vulnerable. So if we are in a position where we are happy with that disparity of power and sort of using that disparity of power to discard the life in the womb, to discard at the end of life, then of course we're going to have this deadening of our own consciences, of our own responsibility to each other. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think it would, it would bring, I would imagine, fear to, I think, the whole euthanasia thing as well. which is another topic in and of itself. But I feel like that coupled with abortion would really bring up a question about what is the valuable of the most vulnerable in our society, people that have disabilities like Down syndrome, for example. You know, are we saying that they are an inconvenience? Are we saying that they shouldn't have been, they should have been terminated before they were born? I'm sure if you ask their families, I'm sure there was difficulty and challenges in raising children who have disabilities or Down syndrome, but they have just as much dignity and worth as somebody else. And I always think too, if the premise is just that it's going to bring suffering upon the parent or society, well, I feel like, I give an example, if you have a child who's off the rails and causing a lot of trouble and may go to jail, for example, or do something in that regard, are they no longer valuable because they've created problems for their parents and their family? They still have dignity, worth and respect. Obviously what they're doing is wrong, but they still have dignity, worth and respect, despite the fact that they have brought suffering upon other people as well. So I think it's quite concerning that we're going down that route. But to bring it back to a faith aspect, I mentioned earlier about St. Paul, where sin did abound, grace did abound much more. That's a verse that I often reflect on, particularly when I feel like we're living through dark times or dark situations. And I know you touched on earlier in our discussion about the exclusion zones around abortion clinics. I remember many years ago during Lent, there was a thing called 40 Days for Life before they brought in the exclusion zone. In fact, I actually think that they brought in the exclusion zone as a result of 40 Days for Life, where we used to pray 24/7 during Lent outside an abortion clinic in Surrey Hills, which is now actually closed.
It has.
Closed many years ago, praise the Lord. But that power of prayer, I feel like it's a bit of a concession that the government has kind of made, that they know how powerful those prayers were. Maybe not from a spiritual perspective, but the witness of people there praying, advocating against that, the impact that it would have had on people who were thinking to have an abortion, to about to walk into that clinic, to maybe think twice. Maybe they have a divine revelation at that particular time, or the ability to have the courage to turn around and say, you know what, we're going to explore other options. How important is it, particularly as the faithful, for us to never give up in the advocacy, in the lobbying, in the joining together to petition our government and our leaders to think of a different perspective around this particular topic, but also, just as importantly, how important is it for us as the faithful to continue praying about this?
Oh my goodness, prayer is so important. So I think we were talking about this before the show as well, saying that the solution to a lot of these life issues is not going to be political. We can't think that, okay, there'll be a change in government and all of a sudden the laws will change. These laws have been passed across the country under both Liberal and Labor governments. They've been pushed by the Greens, all of these types of things. We can't just expect that, okay, in 4 years' time or 8 years' time or whatever it is, another election cycle and the laws will somehow change. I don't believe the answer, at least in the short to medium term, is political. But if it's not political, that means that it's cultural, it's spiritual. And they're the tools that we have at our disposal and that the government can never take away. They can never pass a law. They might push us 150 metres away from an abortion clinic, but they can't take the spiritual weapons that we have with us, off us, only if we lay them down voluntarily, only if we stop praying. I remember, and I'm sure everyone watching would know Francis Tamer. So I remember at that 2019 rally outside Parliament House, I remember him saying to me, you know what, Monica, if Our Lady wanted to, she could appear right on top of this Parliament House right now if she wanted to. So don't you worry about that. If she wanted, she would come. And so this idea of, we have to remember that. We have to remember that our prayers are powerful, that the rosary, that, masses, adoration, those types of things that we can actually, God does listen to persistent prayer and may not grant it in the way and in the time that we want, but certainly things can change. And also, just we were talking about before, you were saying about how abortion changes society, right? And it changes and can make a society more callous, more cold, more rejecting of the most vulnerable. Prayer is a solution to that, because prayer changes us. Yes, God can hear and answer our prayers, but primarily prayer will also change our hearts and change our actions. And that's our response to the callousness of society, is sort of the personal conversion that comes through prayer. So absolutely, if we're only doing the political advocacy, the bringing our MPs, the rallying and everything like that, and we're not praying, then there will be no fruits. The beautiful psalm, like, if the Lord does not build the house, the builders labour in vain.
Amen.
And so that the Lord will build this house.
Amen. And we pray for an end to the abortion industry, and also for the conversion of all those in the abortion industry, and that God may have mercy on all of those that have had abortions, and grant rest to all the children that have been aborted, the many millions and millions over the years, who we never know could have been the future saints of the world, the future presidents or prime ministers, or those who maybe found a cure to cancer. We may never know that, but we entrust them to the mercy of God. And also, I think the most important thing to finish off on is, this is not about condemnation. It's about standing up for, like you said earlier, about the truth and about what's right. And God, being the author of life, he should be the only one that can dictate who lives and who dies. And we've seen over many, many centuries and decades and years that human beings have often tried to play the role of God to no avail, and to great loss, and great loss to themselves and also to their societies. But we pray that, God, the author of life, may really have mercy on all of those in the abortion industry, and that they may have a great conversion and be great advocates against abortion, given their own experiences. But Monica, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's been very insightful, a lot of great lessons I'm sure that a lot of our viewers will be listening to, and we will continue to follow you through the Catholic Weekly and other sources, and we really value your opinions, and really commend you on your advocacy for the truth. God bless you, Monica. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.